Welcome to YU Library Presents, The Making of the Siddur. We are delighted you could all join us this evening. In the morning blessings, we're reminded to pray with intention, to slow down, and think about the words we're saying. Tonight's program invites us to do just that. We are honored to hear from Rabbi Moshe Walter, who will explore the history, development, and halachic dimensions of the Siddur. Our conversation will be guided by Uriel Sussman. Uriel is a PhD student at the Bernard Revel Graduate School, and he's also studying for smicha at RIETS. At the end of the discussion, Rabbi Walter will be happy to take questions. Please enter your questions in the chat. You could do this at any point during the program. Be sure to send them to everyone rather than to a specific co-host or host. This will help us keep track of the questions. Uriel, over to you.
Thank you, Shulamis. It's a distinct privilege to welcome Rabbi Moshe Walter to the latest installment of the Yeshiva University Library Presents series. Our prominent communal leader, Rabbi Walter, serves as the Rav of Woodside Synagogue Ahavas Torah in Silver Spring and the executive director of the Rabbinical Council of Greater Washington. Beyond his pulpit and administrative leadership, he's a prolific author whose Making of series has become an essential resource for understanding the intersection of Jewish law, history, and practice. By meticulously tracing the evolution of the Siddur, the development of minhagim, and the mechanics of the halachic process, his work offers a rare blend of academic rigor and practical guidance. Please join me in welcoming Rabbi Moshe Walter to discuss his latest contributions to contemporary Jewish scholarship, the making of the Siddur. Rabbi Walter.
Thank you, Shulamis. Thank you, Uriel, for the very kind introduction. It's wonderful to be able to be here. I thank you, everybody, for attending. I know it's a busy night, Erev Shabbos. Everybody is a lot on their plates, but thank you for taking an hour out of your day, an evening to spend together. Let me begin a little bit with sort of the backstory behind the book, something you're not going to get by reading the book, and we'll get to that momentarily. You know, how does an author come to write a book, and what brings an author to write a particular book? So I never intended to be an author. I never was trained to be an author. I like writing, I like reading, but I never really sat down to write a particular book. This one was most fascinating. I'm going to take you back to something that you don't want to hear about, and that's COVID. During the COVID months, years, certainly in the beginning of that experience, so shuls were relatively quiet. My shul here in Silver Spring was closed, like many were. And for many, many months, people were struggling, and nobody was going to shul and davening with a minyan, and being in the synagogue was not something that we had the privilege of doing. Much of the early stages of heading back to shul were also complicated. There were smaller minyanim, they were sort of sparse, they were spread apart, they were limited in terms of numbers, who could attend, when you could attend. And the minyanim were also curt, they were shorter, they were sort of streamlined because there was a limited amount of time that we were able to be together in a shul or in a setting together. One of the areas that many rabbis started to struggle with was what are the most critical components of prayer, and what are areas that potentially we could sort of pass on and move on to get the shul back into a place where we could start davening, but not be in a position where we're going to be there for a long time. So one of the areas, I can't speak for all rabbis or shuls, but one of the areas that was cut, at least in my shul, was the end of davening. And that meant on Shabbos, An Mizmiros, Adon Olam, Yigdal. And that section of davening, which is an important part of davening and which is regularly led sometimes by a child in a shul, was cut out. And as the weeks and months went on, and as more people started coming back to shul, I started receiving a lot of pressure from shul members to bring that back. Why are we saying Adon Olam? Why are we not saying Yigdal? What happened to Anim Zmiros? Like, why are we not doing that? So I hemmed and I hawed, and I didn't immediately respond with an absolute answer, but I said, let's see, time will come and we'll do that. The pressure mounted, and I had more and more congregants Shabbos morning saying, Rabbi Walter, the time is come. It's time to go back and to have a regular davening, Adon Olam, Yigdal, An Mizmiros, etc., etc. So when the pressure mounted to such an extent, I said the following thing. I told several people, you know what? I look around on a regular Shabbos and I see when it comes to Adon Olam Yigdal and Anim Zmiros, people are talking, they're taking off their talis, they have one foot out the door, they're dreaming about cholent, they're smelling the kugel, they're not really interested in saying that. So if there's not interest in saying it, I'm not rushing to bring it back. But I said, I'll make you a deal. If I can speak on the following Shabbos about Anim Zmiros, and I talk about Anim Zmiros, the history, the background, the institution, the authorship, so then let's make a deal that I'll do that, and then that would be a way to reintroduce Anim Zmiros back into davening. So that's what I did. And for several weeks, I researched the history, the authorship, the background, the origins, and the sources of Anim Zmiros. And I prepared a shir, and I prepared a lecture on Anim Zmiros. After the lecture, people were astounded and were just amazed by the institution of Anim Zmiros, where it came from, what it was about, who authored it, why it was authored, how it came to the Siddur, why it was at the end of the davening, how come it's said particularly on Shabbos and not on a weekday, why it would be said on a weekday. There's enormous amount of rigor and debate, and if you've read the chapter in the book about Anim Zmiros, you'll be aware that there was somewhat of a very, very significant and heavy debate by some of the great halachic authorities regarding the recitation of Anim Zmiros. Should it be recited? When should it be recited? And if it should be recited altogether. I then explained more about Anim Zmiros, and I saw that the congregation was fascinated by the background, the history, the sources, and the origins of a prayer. And they asked me if I would do that on somewhat of a more regular occasion. And for the next year, 12 months, every 4 weeks, I gave a talk on a different one of the portions of the Siddur. So 1 week was Adon Olam, 1 week was Yigdal, 1 week was Anim Zmiros, 1 week was Berachas HaShachar, 1 week was Ashrei, 1 week was Shema, 1 week was Shmon Esrei. And I saw that people were simply fascinated by the Siddur. And what I learned about the Siddur was the following. I don't know here, I can't ask by a show of hands necessarily, but I would imagine if you look on your shelf right now in your house, the book, the sefer that you probably have the most of is the Siddur. The book that you use the most from childhood till old age is the Siddur. The book that is used by men, by women, by children, by adults, by youngsters, by teenagers, by nursery school students is the Siddur. The Siddur is the most familiar book to us. It's the most popular book. It's the most well-owned book. It's the most well-used book, and it's the book that we have the most of on our shelf. But if I ask the most basic questions to the most intelligent or to the most introductory level crowd, it's hard to be able to get an answer. Who wrote the Siddur? When was the Siddur written? How long did it take for the Siddur to be written? Why was the Siddur written? Is one able to add to the Siddur? Were there prayers that were subtracted to the Siddur? What does it mean, Nusach Ashkenaz and Nusach Sfarad? Why are there certain shuls that do say Tachna that don't say Tachna? Some of the most basic questions about the Siddur that we use daily, 3 times a day, many of us, are unable to be answered. And it was during the course of this year that I began to realize that the book that's most important to us, that's most critical to us, most important to us, is the most hidden. And it is the most obsolete on some level in terms of the knowledge and the base of what people have. And therefore, as a result, I saw that there was a tremendous interest. And as a result, at a certain point, many shul members encouraged me to share the knowledge and the information that I had culled over the course of a year plus and start to present it in the written form. And that's what happened. What's most interesting is we're about 6 months out, and like some people say, people vote with their feet. There's an enormous interest in the book. Baruch Hashem, the book is in its 3rd printing already. And clearly, people are interested in the history, the origins, and the basics of the Siddur, and trying to understand and appreciate not just what do the words mean, and there's some wonderful books out there that explain what the words mean, but to my knowledge, there are very few books, either in Hebrew or in English, that really describe the history, the background, the nature and the origins of the Siddur, and that's really the focus of this book. The Making the Siddur is to allow people a bird's eye view, as well as a very, very detailed view of how it is that the Siddur was written, when it was written, why it was written, who wrote it, and a lot of the rigor and debate surrounding the particular prayers themselves. That is, in a nutshell, the background behind the making of the Siddur. I think, one of the areas that are critical to start with is appreciating something which I think will surprise many. And that is what the Rambam writes. Maimonides, in the beginning of his section on prayer in Hilchos Tefillah, writes that from the time of Moshe Rabbeinu until Ezra HaSofer, so that means the entire period of Tanakh, all of these period of the Chamisha Chumshei Torah, Moshe Rabbeinu to Yoshua to the Zkenim, throughout the prophets, the Nevi'im Rishonim, the Nevi'im Achronim, that means from Yeshayahu, Yirmiyahu, Yecheskel to the Treyasar, until the Ksuvim, which to a certain extent closes, at least in the prophetic period of Ezra HaSofer. So we're talking about all of Tanakh. There was no written word and no book and nothing concrete about the Siddur at all. Just like the Mishnayos were never written, the Shas, the Gemara, was never written down up until Ezra HaSofer. And Ezra HaSofer was living between the first and second temple periods, roughly 250 before the Common Era. There was nothing written. Ezra HaSofer, who was a giant rabbinic leader, one of the great rabbinic leaders, certainly in the times of the prophets, and as many in Chazal refer to, there was nobody greater than Ezra since the time of Moshe Rabbeinu. Ezra HaSofer saw a problem, and as many great rabbinic leaders note, they look in their time period and they recognize that there was something that was significantly missing. And Ezra noticed that as a result of the diaspora, the exile, dispersion of Jews being forced out of their host country and living in a variety of different places, specifically after the destruction of the first Beis HaMikdash, Ezra recognized people didn't know how to daven. People couldn't speak Hebrew. People were living in foreign countries and foreign lands. They were giving birth to children in countries that they were not their homes. They were in the foreign countries and host countries, and nobody knew how to pray. Nobody knew how to daven. So therefore, if we think that Jewish scholarship was greater, it's not true. People were unfamiliar how to pray. The Jewish community in the times of Ezra HaSofer, that means in the times of the prophets, lost knowledge and ability to be able to pray, to daven. The most basic prayers was something that was lost. The Jewish people were illiterate to a certain extent. They were missing most basic Hebrew text and Hebrew language skills. And Ezra HaSofer recognized that we're going to lose the Jewish people as a result, and therefore we need to formalize Jewish prayer. If the Jewish people are unable to pray and connect to God, we have lost not only a generation, but potentially we're losing the Torah and the ability to continue the Masorah and to continue the transition of Torah from generation to generation. And Ezra HaSofer, along with some of the greatest scholars, rabbis, and prophets between the first and second temple period, organized what we call tefillah. And what we mean by tefillah is not the siddur. The Gemara tells us that he did four things. He established called tefillah, bracha, kedusha, and havdalah. Those are four very, very specific areas. The Gemara says tefillah refers actually to Shemona Esrei. So Ezra HaSofer established the most basic template of prayer. Now, it was not written down, but it was codified as this is what the Jewish nation should pray, this is what the Jewish people should daven, and this is the way that they could connect to God, and this is a way to inspire and to encourage continuity for the Jewish people's spiritual connection to God. So did that work? Was Ezra HaSofer successful? Was the Anshe Knesset Hagdolah successful? Yes and no. There is a Gemara in Maseches Megillah that indicates that there was a gentleman by the name of Shimon HaPikuli. Now, Pikuli means a cotton picker. Now, if you never heard of Shimon HaPikuli, don't feel bad because he's not very well known. Shimon HaPikuli was a cotton picker. And the Talmud tells us that this fellow Shimon established Shmona Esrei. That's what it says. The Gemara says, Maseches Megillah Daf Tezayin, Shimon HaPikuli established the Shmona Esrei. So the Gemara says, really? The Talmud teaches us in Tractate Brachos, which I just referred to moments ago, that the Anshe Knesset Hagdolah, that Ezra HaSofer established Shmona Esrei, Brachos, Tfilos, Kedushos, Havdalos. What does that mean? Shimon HaPikuli, this cotton picker, picking cotton, right, in the early part of the Common Era, established, after the destruction of the first Beis HaMikdash, she established Shmona Esrei. How's that feasible? How's that possible? Ezra, who's the great prophet, the great scholar, the leader of the Anshe Knesset Hagdolah, that was his job. So the Gemara answers with four words. Shachachum, v'chazrum, v'hiskinu. The people forgot what the Anshe Knesset Hagdolah did. They forgot it. They were unable to retain the information that the Anshe Knesset Hagdolah established, and they forgot it. And it's not so simple for Jewish continuity, even at the times of the prophets. Things were hard, times were difficult, there was expulsion, there was dispersion, There were challenges. The Jewish people struggled from strong rabbinic leadership, and people were forced to different places. And as a result, things got forgotten, and people were illiterate. And there was no pen, there was no paper, there was no printing press, and things got lost. So therefore, Shimon HaPikuli, a regular cotton picker, recognized this challenge, and he forced the reinstitution of Shemona Esrei. So there it is. For about a 400-year period, the Jewish people were struggling with the institution of the Anshe Knesset Agdola in roughly 250 CE. Shimon HaPikuli, 400 years later, in the beginning of the Common Era, reestablished and instituted it yet again to strengthen the Jewish nation's connection to prayer. And I ask you again, did that succeed? Did Shimon HaPikuli succeed in reestablishing, reigniting, and re-inspiring the Jewish people to pray? The answer is not exactly. Because roughly 800 years later, and we don't have a lot of data in terms of what happened between the time period that I'm about to describe to you, but in roughly the year 875 of the Common Era, something fascinating happened. A very strong Jewish community existed in Spain, and particularly in Barcelona. Very strong Jewish group, Jewish entity, a stronghold of the Jewish people was established in Spain. The rabbis of the Jewish community in Barcelona recognized that their community also didn't know how to daven. People were unfamiliar with the prayers. And again, I'm taking you from the beginning of the Common Era, after the destruction of the first Beis HaMikdash, to 875 of the Common Era. So we're talking about roughly 750 to 800 years later that the rabbis of Spain write a letter. And they write a letter to Surah, to Pumbedisa, to the Gaonim in Palestine, to the great Gaon and the well-known sage and the leading halachic and Torah authority, who was known as Reb Amram Gaon. Reb Amram Gaon was one of the leading Gaonim, and they sent a letter to Reb Amram Gaon that our people don't know how to pray. Send us and establish for us what they called a Seder HaTfilah. Give us something that we could give our constituents and that we could give our community members and we could give our community to pray. They don't know how to pray. They're illiterate. They're not scholars, they're not rabbis, they're lay people, and they don't know how to pray, and they want to pray. And we as the rabbis in Barcelona are looking to you, Rav Amram Gaon, in Surah, in Pumbedisa, known as the Shtei Yeshivos. He was the Rosh Yeshiva. Send us back a letter with what it is that the people should pray. Rav Amram Gaon sent back a letter, which today and later in Jewish history became known as the Seder or the Siddur of Rav Amram Gaon. And for all intents purposes, that is the first siddur ever written in Jewish history, is the siddur of Rav Amram Gaon in roughly the year 875 of the Common Era. Now, if you were to pick up the siddur of Rav Amram Gaon today and go to shul tomorrow on Shabbos and try to use it, it's not going to work. You are going to be lost. Whether you're Ashkenaz or whether you're Sfard, whether you're Nusach Sfard, whether you're Teimani, whether you're Sfardi, Daven Moroccan, you're going to be lost because it doesn't look like our siddur, doesn't talk like our siddur, doesn't act like our siddur, doesn't smell like our siddur. It's a very, very rough template of what our siddur looks like. But it is the most critical siddur because Rabbeinu Tam himself writes, one of the great Balei Tosfos, that anybody who is not an expert in the Seder or the Siddur of Rav Amram Gaon has no right to write, to talk, or to extrapolate, or to add or subtract to the prayer book. Only if you're an expert in the Seder of Rav Amram Gaon. So Rav Amram Gaon really establishes for posterity the first Siddur. However, from roughly 1,000 years before that, Ezra HaSofer tried and began. Now, of course, there was nothing written because as a result of the institution that we only teach Torah by tradition, where nothing is to be written down, nothing was written down until Rav Amram Gaon. But from roughly the days of Moshe Rabbeinu, through the Nevi'im and through Ksuvim, till Ezra HaSofer, everybody davened what they wanted, when they davened, how they davened. Avram, Yitzchak, Yaakov, Sarah, Rivka, Rachel, Leah, they davened as many times as they want, however they wanted, and when they felt like davening. There was no requirement and obligation to pray. Ezra HaSofer, between the first and second temple period, understood that we need to establish some and concretize some form of prayer, and that's what he did before the Common Era. And now, roughly 1,000 years later, for the first time, there is in print a siddur which was authored by Rav Amram Gaon. And again, I ask you the same question I've been asking. Did that work? Was that the siddur that is absolutely, positively the siddur that each of us hold dear today? And of course, we'll answer yes and no. Yes, because without the Seder of Rav Amram Gaon, the Siddur would never have begun, but no, for the following reason. We're so familiar with books and we're inundated with books. But before the printing press, books were not a commodity. It was not something that was available, not something that was feasible. But the Seder of Amram Gon became so important and so critical that every chazan in every shul, in every community, and in every continent wanted to get hold of Rav Amram Gon's Seder because it was so beneficial, so important, and it was so essential to be able to hear, to say what it is that the greatest rabbi established as the organized prayer based upon Ezra, based upon Shimon Abikuli, based upon the Anshe Knesset Agdola. So what happens when all you have is one manuscript, and one manuscript starts passing itself around from shul to shul, from community to community, and from country to country? It's edited, it's redacted, it's changed, it has footnotes and notes in it, and therefore, as a result, the Seder of Rav Amram Gon is hard to know absolutely positively what it was that Rav Amram Gon signed off on, because many rabbis and community leaders and chazanim in each of their communities and shuls wrote their own footnotes and their own explanations and their own annotations to his siddur. And therefore, what really belongs to Rav Amram Gon, what belongs to the community in Krakow, what belongs to the chazan in France, what belongs to the chazan in Worms, and what belongs to the chazan in Argentina? It's hard to know. And therefore, there are many different manuscripts that are known as the Seder of Rav Amram Gon. In the last 30 to 50 years, there's been an enormous amount of work done on the Seder of Rav Amram Gon to elucidate and to try to really work through the varying manuscripts of Rav Amram Gon to hone in on what was Rav Amram Gon and what was added and what was redacted. But nonetheless, the Seder of Rav Amram Gon established for us the beginning for the first time a very clear Siddur of what should be prayed and how should be prayed. It included the Tefillah of Shachris, of Mincha, of Maariv, the Tefillah of Shabbos and Yomim Tovim, and the Yom Noraim, but it's a skeleton and a template. It's not all-inclusive, and again, if you get a hold of one, and there are many Seder of Rav Amram Gons that are available today, there are between 4 and 6 different editions that exist today of the Seder of Rav Amram Gon, you will notice that you will have a very hard time. If you want to go to shul and to use that siddur, you will not be able to follow the davening in your particular synagogue. Where do we go from that? Roughly 100 years later, in the year 970 and change, the next great Gon, his name was Reb Saadia Gon, and Reb Saadia Gon then authored a siddur as well. Now, Reb Saadia Gon's siddur is a critical siddur, but it's quite different than a Rav Amram Gon siddur for at least 2 reasons. Reason number 1, as opposed to Siddur of Rav Amram Gon, which was written in Hebrew, in Lashon HaKodesh, Reb Saadia Gon's Siddur was written in Aramaic, so it was not written in Hebrew. Number 2 is different because Reb Saadia Gon himself was different. Reb Saadia Gon was a bit of a maverick. He was a very, very great scholar, especially a well-known philosopher. He wrote one of the most important early Jewish works of philosophy, the Emunos V'Deos. But Reb Saadia Gon didn't necessarily toe to the party line of the Gaonim, and he didn't always agree with the halachic conclusions of the Gaonim and often took different positions than the Gaonim. And therefore, Reb Saadia Gon's siddur often will vary in its positions from Rav Amram Gon or other the great Gaonim. And therefore, Reb Saadia Gon's siddur not necessarily is the standard approach of the community of Gaonim in Surah and Pumbedisa and in the Shtei Yeshivos. And therefore, Reb Saadia Gon's siddur became a little bit more closed. Number 1, because it wasn't written in Hebrew, and his explanations were not written in Hebrew, and his halachos were not written in Hebrew. But nonetheless, Reb Saadia Gon's siddur was a tremendous contribution to the siddur, and as a tremendous contribution to the continuity of the siddur and the growth of the siddur. The story doesn't end here, because as we move from Spain and to Bavel and to Sur and to Pumbedisa and the communities and the communication between those 2 communities, the next great addition to the siddur takes place in France. And one of the great rabbinic scholars living in France in the year 1000 is Rashi. And many people are familiar with the commentary of Rashi, Rashi's commentary on the Torah, Rashi's commentary on the Mishnayos, Rashi's commentary on the Gemara. Rashi is arguably one of the most important Torah commentaries. And Rashi added to the siddur. Now, Rashi himself never authored a siddur, although there's something called the siddur of Rashi. Rashi had something called the Beis Medrash. Rashi had students, and Rashi had students who surrounded him and spent time with him and studied with him, which is known as the Beis Medrash of Rashi. And many of the students of Rashi worked on the Siddur and what it was that Rashi davened. Now, you'll ask, why is that so important? The reason that it's so important is because anybody who's a student of Torah understands that Rashi's commentary on the Torah and Rashi's commentary on the prophets, on the Nevi'im, Rashi's commentary on Mishnayos, Rashi's commentary on Gemara are essential. It's the backbone. It's the staple of understanding much of Torah Shebechsav and Torah Shebe'al Peh. Therefore, the significance of Rashi's commentary on the Torah is going to be equivalent to Rashi's commentary on the Siddur. And if we know what Rashi prayed, how Rashi prayed, and what exactly it was that Rashi understood were the appropriate prayers to be recited, at that point we've gained a significant amount of information that can continue to help us understand how to pray and the tefillos that we should recite. And one of Rashi's primary disciples was somebody by the name of Rabbi Simcha of Vitry, who authored a work called the Machzor Vitry. I wish we had more time to talk about the Machzor Vitry, but the way that we refer to a Machzor today is not the way that the Rishonim, the medieval scholars, refer to a Machzor. Today when we talk about a Machzor, we talk about the Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur, Pesach, Shavuos Machzor. A Machzor in the times of the Rishonim rather referred to an all-encompassing book which included all the prayers of the year, all the rules that a community needed to know, and it was the Bible that existed in each community. So therefore, the Machzor Vitry meant it was the Machzor, the book that was the source of all rabbinic information, including the Siddur, that existed in the city of Vitry. Vitry was in France, and that was the Beis Medrash of Rashi. So if you take a look at that Siddur, and today it's been elucidated in roughly 8 volumes by Daniel Goldschmidt, who's an outstanding scholar and expert in liturgy and in the Siddur and in the Machzor in general. And in the Siddur of the Rashi, of the Machzor Vitry, you begin to see Rashi's approach and the French scholars' approach and the Tosfos approach to the Siddur, and we begin to benefit from a Siddur that begins to explain and look closer to the Siddur that we hold. But again, if you take a look at the Machzor Vitry and you bring it to Shul and Shabbos, you'll be lost. You won't be able to follow. But that was another very, very great addition to the Siddur. So if we're moving from Bavel, Sura, Pompadisa, and Spain, we've now traveled to France, and this is a great addition that takes place in France. Roughly 100 years later, in the year 1100 and 1200, the next great addition to the Siddur takes place in Germany. And there were a group of scholars who were known as the Hasidei Ashkenaz. The Hasidei Ashkenaz were pious and ascetics, very, very great scholars, led by one of the earliest of the Hasidei Ashkenaz, who's Rabbi Yehuda HaChassid, the author of the famed work Sefer Hasidim. One of the later authors and members of this group was the Rokeach, Rabbi Eliezer Rokeach, who was also one of the great German scholars. And together they made an enormous addition to the Siddur. Now, what they did is something that never existed yet. And they began to look at the text of the Siddur, of Shemona Esrei, of Shema, of the prayers that were authorized by the Anshe Knesset Agdol, including the brachos, the kedushos, the havdalos, and started to count the words that existed in each of the blessings, and they were able to use the number of words that were in each bracha. So if you open up your Siddur and you look in Shemona Esrei, how many words are in the 7th blessing, the 10th blessing, the 13th blessing, they begin to count each of the words and show how the word count in each blessing is uniquely significant to that blessing, and show how it corroborates with another verse somewhere in Tanakh. And if you focus on the words specifically, you'll be able to appreciate the Siddur that much more. So on some level, they were numerologists, they were Kabbalists, they were ascetics, and they were scholars, and they were experts in the text of the Siddur. And what they began to do was to focus specifically on the text and to understand and to recognize the specificity of the words being used, why they were used, and to hone in on explaining to the Jewish community the importance of each and every word. And that's not something that existed yet. That's the addition that existed in Germany in 1100 and 1200. If you continue throughout that time period till roughly the year 1500, that's what was taking place. The Rishonim that existed in France and the Sephardic Rishonim that were in Italy, as well as in Spain, and as well as the Rishonim who were in Germany, began to extrapolate the Siddur, to explain the Siddur, and to work with the Siddur based upon the text. And you'll begin to see enormous amount of Siddurim that are written in this time period, the medieval time period. You'll note the Rambam, Maimonides, authored a Siddur. And many of you might enjoy the Siddur of the Rambam because you could probably finish the Rambam's entire Siddur from the time you wake up until Yom Kippur in about a half an hour. That means the entire Siddur of the Rambam. You could start from Moda'ani, which, by the way, was only a later edition. If we have time, we could talk about that. But the Rambam Siddur is extraordinarily short, very terse, very brief, and very curt. So the Rambam writes a Siddur. The great Rishonim, the Ritva has a Siddur. The Rokeach has a Siddur. Rabbi Yehuda HaChassid has a Siddur. All of the Rishonim, many of the great medieval scholars, as I mentioned, who are living in all of the countries that we are familiar with, began to write Siddurim and to base their Siddur on Rashi, on the Chasidei Ashkenaz, and upon the works of the Anshe Knesset Agdola. And that is where the Siddur begins to find its form. Now, if you would then pick up a Siddur of the Rambam, or of Rashi, or any of the Rishonim, you're going to note that you could start to follow the Siddur, and the template of Shachris and Mincha Ma'ariv already exists, but again, it's very, very different than the way our Siddur looks. The next great edition that takes place is not in France, is not in Germany, and it's not in any of the areas of Bavel or Spain that I've described, but it takes us to a very small town, a small village, a name that you're all familiar with, in one of the most northern parts of Israel, and that's a very small city known as Tzfas. Tzfas is a critical city. It's an important city, and early 1500s and throughout the 16th century, Tzfas was actually a much more important city than Yerushalayim. It was the most significant rabbinic city in Israel at the time. The greatest rabbinic authorities were living there, and that's where the formation of Kabbalah takes place. Some of the great Kabbalists, halachic authorities, including Rabbi Yosef Karo, who authored the Shulchan Aruch, Rabbi Shlomo Alkabetz, Rabbi Moshe Cordovero, the Sefer Charedim, the Mabit, as well as all of the very well-known Kabbalists who were living in Tzfas during the 16th century, made significant additions to the Siddur. Now, in my estimation, it doesn't seem that they intended to have such a radical effect and impact on the Siddur, but their success was extraordinary. And let's just share with you but a few things that the Kabbalists did. Number one, and arguably the most important thing that they did, was authoring Kabbalah Shabbos. That's how we begin every Shabbos. Now, Kabbalah Shabbos, as we know it, is something that we have on a certain scale is equivalent to any of the other prayers that we daven. But the Hasidim and the Kabbalists living in Tzfas never intended that it should be what it is today. One of the great Kabbalistic works, which was written during that time period, it was a colleague of Rabbi Yosef Karo. His name was Rabbi Moshe ben Machir. Rabbi Moshe ben Machir was a Rosh Hashiva. He was a rabbi in a neighboring village called Zitun in the north of Israel near Tzfas. And he has a work called the Seder Hayom. And in that work, he describes the founding of Kabbalah Shabbos and what the Kabbalists were doing. Kabbalah Shabbos was authored by two brothers-in-law, actually a student and his teacher, Rabbi Moshe Cordovero and Shlomo Alkabetz. Shlomo Alkabetz was the author of the Chadodi. Rabbi Moshe Cordovero authored the first 6 chapters that we recite in Kabbalah Shabbos. And he writes that they went out into the fields in Tzfas. Anybody who's spent some time in Tzfas can appreciate for a moment what that must look like. Beautiful mountains, quiet, peaceful. And they would walk out, he writes, in a chabura. They would walk out in a group. They didn't say it in shul. They walked out to the fields, Chakal, Tapuch, and Kadishin, into these apple orchards specifically, which is a discussion for a different time. And they would recite chapters of Tehillim well in advance of Shabbos. Their intention was that this should not be something which caught on like wildfire and that the entire Jewish nation would pick up. But that's what happened. And slowly but surely, this service, which we refer today as Kabbalah Shabbos, made its way from the north of Israel to Yerushalayim, from Yerushalayim to Spain, from Spain to Germany, from Germany throughout Eastern Europe, and even in Germany, where the rabbinate was very, very careful in terms of what was in and what was out, what was one is allowed to pray and not allowed to pray. Even in Germany, they picked up on Kabbalah Shabbos. It didn't happen so easily. If you take a look at one of the great halachic authorities, Rabbi Avram Gambiner, the Magen Avram, living at a very similar time period in the 1500s, he writes that there were actually ante-rooms where Kabbalah Shabbos was recited. They would not recite it in the shul because the shul is limited to Shachris, to Mincha, and to Marav. You might know, and I'll share with you a little tidbit and an anecdote, anybody who's in shul on Friday night, you'll notice where is Kabbalah Shabbos, where does the Chazan stand for Kabbalah Shabbos? He doesn't stand at the Amud where the Chazan stands for Shachris, for Mincha, for Marav, and Musaf. the chazan stands at the bima where we lane. Why would we do that? Every other prayer leader for every other service begins Shachris, Mincha, Marv, and stands for the duration of leading the congregation at the front of the shul, not in the middle of the shul. The middle of the shul is limited for Torah reading, for Kriyas Torah, or for blowing the shofar. Nothing else happens in the middle of the sanctuary, in the bima, besides for the Kriyas Torah. So some have noted, and you go take a look at many sources, I discussed this at length in one of my chapters on Kabbalah Shabbos, and the reason for the standing of the chazan in the middle of the synagogue was for one of two reasons. Either to show that it's not a regular prayer service. It's not like Shachris. It's not like Mincha. It's not like Marv. It's not a standardized prayer. It wasn't authorized, and it wasn't accepted, and it wasn't concretized by Anshe Knesset Agdol, not by Shimon Apikuli, not by the Chasidei Ashkenaz, not by Rashi. It was never established by the Rishonim. If you take a look in the Rambam, the Tur, the Beis Yosef, the Shach, the Taz, the Magen Avraham, or any of the classic codes of Jewish law, beginning in the time period of the Rishonim up until the classic running commentaries in Shulchan Aruch, you'll find nothing about Kabbalah Shabbos. Kabbalah Shabbos is a much later institution. For all intents and purposes, it's a relatively new prayer. 500 years old at most, and in many communities it never hit until the 1600s and 1700s. It's a new prayer, but it caught on like wildfire. So therefore, in order to indicate that it's not a standard prayer like Shachris, Mincha, Maariv, therefore it is recited in the middle of the synagogue, and that's where the chazan stands. A second reason for that is to indicate and to memorialize and commemorate, just like the Kabbalists left the synagogue and found themselves in the great mountains of Tzfas, we too leave our space. And the chazan it's as if he leaves shul. He's in the middle. He's not where he always is, also indicating that I'm not in the ordinary place. And that, of course, becomes the custom why we turn around when we get to the end of Kabbalah Shabbos, look toward the door, pine in a different direction in order to indicate that the Shabbos is coming. This is not all the Kabbalists did. The Kabbalists had many significant additions to the Siddur. Another very significant addition of the Kabbalists was a tefillah called Yom Kippur Katan, which over the last 50 to 75 years has become much more popular. It's an entire prayer service that is recited Erev Rosh Chodesh, and in many, many communities this has become common, rigour, practice to recite the tefillah of Yom Kippur Katan. Rosh Chodesh is considered to be a time of tshuva, and therefore Erev Rosh Chodesh itself is a time to reconnect to God and to repent, and therefore they instituted an entire prayer service called Yom Kippur Katan, a mini Yom Kippur. That was an institution of the Kabbalists as an entire prayer. The Mikubalim also instituted something which some of you might be familiar with, in Elul. Every single day, we recite and we add an additional chapter of Tehillim at the end of the davening, Psalm 27, L'David Hashem Ori V'ishi. That was an addition of the Kabbalists. So the Kabbalists sprinkled the entire Siddur with new prayers or additions to the prayers. And therefore, their significant addition to the Siddur is hard to underestimate. And you'll take a look again throughout the book. I refer to many, many different tefillos, many different prayers, and many sections which they added. So if we've traveled from the year 875 to roughly the year 1575, so we're talking roughly about 600 years and change of development of the Siddur. So did we finish? Is the Siddur complete with all the additions from Spain to Germany to France to Yerushalayim to Tzfas? Has the Siddur completed? The answer is no. Something fascinating happened, and I see I'm already at 8:40, but I'm going to do my best to try to wrap up somewhere between 8:45 and 8:50. I'll take questions, and we could do part two. The Vaad Arba Artzos, which is a very critical rabbinic organization in 4 different countries in Eastern Europe, commissioned a man by the name of Rabbi Shapsi Sofer to finally authorize and to concretize the Siddur. The Siddur is being developed for hundreds of years, from 975. And now in the year 1660, the Vaad Arba Artzos hires a gentleman, a great scholar, a Kabbalist, a grammarian, a Torah scholar, who they felt comfortable could finally put the Siddur to bed and to organize the ultimate Siddur of all Siddurim. Rabbi Shapsi Sofer was an incredible individual, a very important person, And he was commissioned to write this Siddur, which all of the rabbinate understood throughout these four lands, the most significant countries at that time that had the largest Jewish communities, that finally the Siddur would be established for posterity, would no longer would have to go through hoops to try to know what to pray, when to pray, how to pray. This Siddur of Rabbi Shapsi Sofer probably gained the most significant approbations in Jewish history. It received haskamos from the Megala Amukos, from the Kleyakar, from the Bach, and from all of the members of the Vaad Arba Artzos. It is the most important Siddur, most critical Siddur. He was a student of the Marshal, the Yam Shel Shlomo, Rabbi Shlomo Luria, who also gave him a haskama. And the Siddur of Reb Shapsi Sofer was worked on for a significant amount of time, for years and years. Reb Shapsi Sofer dedicated his life to authoring the ultimate Siddur. And it was ultimately published in Prague in 1667. The Siddur exists today. It's been redone, elucidated. It's a 4-volume work today that was put out roughly 20 years ago, again, by Ner Yisrael in Baltimore. They did a wonderful job elucidating the Siddur of Rabbi Shapsi Sofer. And Rabbi Shapsi Sofer did a job of all jobs, trying to put together all of the things that we've been discussing, from the Anshe Knesset Agdola, through the institutions of the Rambam and of Rashi and the Machzor Vitri, the Hasidei Ashkenaz from France, from Germany, and everything in between, to really concretize the Siddur. It was a very significant addition to the Siddur. It was a very important work, and many of the psakim, many of the halachic rulings that we have today, revolving around what should be said and should not be said, often reflect back to the work of Rabbi Shapsi Sofer. Any scholar of the Siddur needs to be familiar with the Siddur of Rabbi Shapsi Sofer, and always to research and to take a look how Rabbi Shapsi Sofer authorized what was said, what it was said, their footnotes and their notes, and everything is explained in the Siddur of Rabbi Shapsi Sofer. And I ask you again, was that the final Siddur authored? And the answer, of course, is yes and no. Because something very significant happened in the 17th century and the 18th century, and this is really a lecture, a shiur in its own, and that was the Vilna Gaon. And this requires its own lecture, but the Vilna Gaon, who died in 1797, arguably is one of the greatest Torah authorities in the last 300 years, and arguably even before that. And the Vilna Gaon also had a lot to add to the Siddur. The Vilna Gaon never authored a Siddur, and what many people familiarize or refer to contemporarily as the Nusach HaGra is not the Siddur of the Gra. The Gra never wrote a Siddur. He didn't have time to write a Siddur, but the Gra was an extraordinarily prolific author and wrote on every area of Torah, in Torah Sheb'chsav and Torah Sheba'al Peh. So therefore, we have a patchwork of rulings of the Vilna Gaon in a variety of different places referring to his commentary relating to the Siddur. So therefore, no Siddur could be complete without the rulings and the decisions of the Vilna Gaon. So therefore, albeit that the Siddur of Shapsi Gaon in 1667 concretized to a certain extent everything that took place up until then, without the Vilna Gaon, that Siddur doesn't carry the same weight, although its importance cannot be underestimated. And therefore, in the 1700s, we begin to understand what it is that the Vilna Gaon understood was the basics, the backgrounds, and the skeleton of the Siddur. His students picked up on what it was that the Gra davened. One of his closest students, who davened with the Gaon regularly, wrote a work called the Ma'aseh Rav, and in the Ma'aseh Rav, he collects the rulings of the Vilna Gaon on the Siddur. And finally, we begin to appreciate the Vilna Gaon's additions to the Siddur. But it doesn't end there, because anybody who's familiar with a little bit of Jewish history in the 1800s knows that there's another great significant event that takes place in that time period, and that, of course, is Chasidus. The development of Chasidus, Hasidic courts take place, and therefore Hasidim and the great Hasidic masters add significantly to the Siddur. And that's what we refer to as Nusach Sfard. And Nusach Sfard, as opposed to the Nusach HaGra, along with Nusach Ashkenaz, and along with Sfaradi Nusach, what we call Edut Mizrach today, all begin to work together. And therefore, the Hasidic dialect and the Hasidic Nusach also takes place in the 1800s. And therefore, I argue, as I answer the question that we began with, how long did the Siddur take to be written? At least 1,000 years. From the first Siddur in 875, until the 1800s, the Siddur was being written, redacted, explained, elucidated, and authored by grammarians, by philosophers, by halachists, by numerologists, by scholars, everybody added something to the Siddur. There is no prayer that is unique to one specific person. So one person didn't write the Siddur. So if you've gained anything from this talk, if somebody asks you who wrote the Siddur, the answer is no longer the Anshe Knesset Agdola. Certainly they are credited with beginning the process of the writing of the Siddur, but they never wrote a Siddur. The Siddur didn't exist for another 1,000 years. They created the backbone, the template for the Siddur through Tfilos, Kedushos, Havdalos, and Brachos. So we know about Birchos Hashachar from the Anshe Knesset Agdola. We're familiar with Shmona Esrei from the Anshe Knesset Agdola. We're familiar with Shema because Shema and Vayim Shema exist in Torah Shebechsav. And we're familiar with Birchos Kriya Shema because that was also written by the Anshe Knesset Agdola. But Psukei Ad Zimra, which we didn't even begin to touch, which is an entire chapter in the book, is one of the most fascinating chapters. How Psukei Ad Zimra developed, where did it come from? Who wrote Psukei Ad Zimra? Where did Tehillim come into the Siddur from? When did that become concretized? Who decided which chapters of Tehillim are supposed to be read? Why are they there? Where do they belong from? If you take a look in the Gemara, there's nothing even referred to as Psukei Ad Zimra. So where did that come from? Where did that start? And this is part of the research that takes place. Now, what happened from roughly the year 1800 and throughout the 19th century was concretizing the Siddur and organizing everything that existed up until that point. There's very little addition that takes place in the Siddur after the Vilna Gaon, who died, as I noted, in 1797. After the editions of Nusach Sfard in the 1800s, there's very little addition. So if you take a look at a Siddur published in the 1800s and even the 1700s, those Siddurim will be very, very familiar to you, and you will have a much easier time using those. The Nusach of the Gra, by the way, which makes the Gra's Nusach much different and uniquely different than the Siddur of the Hasidic community, is that the Vilna Gaon took the position, the entire chapter dedicated in the book to the Vilna Gaon's approach to the Siddur, is that it should be limited. The Vilna Gaon loved the Jewish people. He didn't want them to be in shul so long. And he didn't want them to have to daven too long. And he only authorized the prayers to be recited based upon that which the Anshe Knesset Agdola codified, and limited additions by the Gaonim and some of the Paitanim, including Rabbi Elazar Kalir, which we don't have time to talk about tonight. But this 1,000-year period that I'm describing, from roughly 875 till 1875 and change, more or less, is the time period that it took for the Siddur to be written. These are some of the highlights of the Siddur, the history of the Siddur. We haven't had time, of course, to talk about the publication of the Siddur, which is a fascinating part of the Sidur's history, how some prayers snuck into the Siddur and some prayers that we recite weren't necessarily codified and didn't necessarily receive the approval of the rabbinic community. Many prayers that you and I are both familiar with, which are very commonly recited in the Siddur, didn't necessarily receive the approbation of the rabbinic community. If you're familiar, many publishers at the beginning of the time of the printing press were not Jewish. They were great Italian and great Spanish non-Jewish printers who were making a boatload of money because Jews love books and buying books, and therefore they somehow put things into the Siddur that weren't authorized by the rabbin or by the rabbinic community. So therefore, that's a whole different discussion, a different time. I hope I've done a little bit of justice to the book. All I could do really is encourage you to buy the book. That's a little bit of self-advertising. I think everybody will benefit from it. There's a lot to learn. I fully believe, and what I have seen certainly for myself, if somebody understands not just the words, but the background and the history of the Siddur, I really believe that you'll be able to appreciate the prayers much more. You'll know the difference between Ashrei and Shmona Esrei. You'll understand the difference between Berchas Kriya Shema and Berchas HaShachar. If you know the author of the book and who the author was, you'll begin to appreciate that prayer, understand it better, and know the difference between Anim Zmiros and Ashrei. Why do we cut out Adon Olam? Why do some shuls not say Adon Olam and Anim Zmiros? Let's say I'm late to shul, which I know doesn't happen to anybody. But if I can only daven part of Psukei Ad Zimra, so can I skip certain passages? And maybe if I can skip certain passages, maybe that's an indication of which prayers are more important. Well, what happened to the end of davening? I just spoke about Shemona Esrei. Where did Ashrei come from again? And why Uval Etzion? And why Lam Natseach? Where did Aleinu come from? What about Moda'ani? All of these prayers, all of these questions are addressed in the book. I thank everybody for joining. The title of the book is called The Making of the Siddur. Published by Feldheim. I'm sure Shulamis or Uriel could tell you more about it. I'm happy to answer questions. If you don't get to have your question answered, I'd be happy to, if you want to email me, I'm more than happy to answer your questions as well like that.
I just want to thank you so much. I just want to point out before Uriel takes the stage that because your background was blurred, the book didn't show us. So here's the book, and Uriel's going to explain how to order it. I don't know if you could see it because for me it's backwards. Is it backwards on your end also?
Looks good.
Okay, looks good. All right, we're good. It's a beautiful cover.
Thank you.
Okay, Uriel, go ahead.
Yeah, okay. For anyone who wants to purchase a copy of the book, we're putting the Yeshiva University Library has graciously got hold of a number of copies at a discounted rate. Putting the link to order that in the chat. Rabbi Walter, I think we have some questions in the chat now. David has asked that he recently read that the idea of davening in a language many don't understand is a relatively recent phenomenon. What do you suggest be done to give davening more meaning to more people?
So it's called a fastball down the middle you gave me. I really do believe that understanding the Siddur, reading the book, I do believe will be helpful to you. Understanding the authorship, the background, the institution, when the prayers were written, why they were written, and a lot of debate, by the way, which I didn't have time to talk about. A lot of debate existed in the Siddur. If a prayer could be added, can a prayer be added? L'David Hashem Ori, which I refer to, the 27th Psalm, which we recite in Elul, is a vehement debate whether it should be included in the Siddur or not. The Vilna Gaon was a staunch opponent that it should not be included. Kabbalah Shabbos is not necessarily recited in all communities. There's certain communities that don't recite Kabbalah Shabbos. There's certain synagogues that will recite Anim Zmiris on a daily basis. We didn't talk about Birchas Kohanim. In Israel, we recite Birchas Kohanim daily. In Chutz La'aretz, in the diaspora, we don't. Why? What's the difference? All of these tefillos and all of these prayers, if you understand them and appreciate who authored them, when they were authored, why they were authored, the background in terms of what was allowed to be included, what was not included, which prayers were recited, why they were recited, when they were recited. I think that's all very helpful, and I believe and I'm grateful and humbled that people are finding that to be the case.
Hayatara Kantor asks, what about Siddurim like Korban Mincha, which were directed to women? Who is the creator and how is it designed or organized?
Yeah, that's a great question. So those are relatively new Siddurim. And that existed in the time period that I referred to. Once the Siddur was concretized, what happened post 1800 and relatively in that time, there began to be more of a focus on kavana and what should be recited and how it should be recited. So therefore, during the time period, the 1800s and the late 1700s, each community began to focus on a siddur that would work for their community. So the German community had their focus of how a siddur should be written. The Sephardic community started to focus on their nusach. The Teimanim had their old ancient nusach, the some called Nusach Rome, which was an ancient nusach. Every community began to focus on their particular need. The Hasidic community, the Munkancharav had a very, very important siddur. And therefore, each community began to have a siddur that was unique to them. As I've shown, the Jewish community throughout Jewish history struggled with literacy. And therefore, before Sarah Schneer and the Beis Yaakov movement, women were unable to daven and to pray unless their mother taught them. And many of their mothers didn't know how to daven. Many of their fathers didn't know how to daven. So Siddurim in Yiddish, the Tzenerena, were all focused on how exactly people could be able to connect and to daven in a way that would be most productive. And of course, today that speaks to why we have Siddurim in every language, in English and in French and in Spanish and in Russian and in Italian. There's a Siddur in every language because Hebrew is not necessarily so simple. And even today, for the greatest scholars, and anyone who's gone through a yeshiva system or a day school system, there are many words in tefillah that we struggle with, that we don't understand, and we're unable to recite with clarity. So therefore, once the siddur was ultimately established and what to say was more understood, there began to be more of a focus on the words and explaining those words. And that's what happens really, and we didn't have time to talk about it, but with the Machzor and with Piyutim and with Tehillim and with a variety of different tefillos. And this was the reason, by the way, that the Vilna Gaon wanted to limit the Siddur because there was too much. And people weren't understanding what they were saying, when they were saying, and why they were saying it. So that's why the Shulchan Aruch codifies in the first siman, Tov ma'at bekarvana meharbe below kavana. Better to say a little with focus and attention than to say a lot without knowing what you're saying. And that's something that I think is an important rule as well. To get back to the first question I was asked, people shouldn't use the siddur as a, like we like to say, don't daven it up. The goal is not to get from page 1 to page 200 in 30 minutes or 60 minutes. The goal is to connect to God. And therefore, the focus on prayer should be saying what you're saying properly. And therefore, one of the goals of tefillah, and the ultimate goal of tefillah, and what I try to bring out in the book, is allowing people to be able to appreciate the siddur in a way that you could understand the background, the origins, the development, the authorship, and some of the rigorous debates that existed in terms of the prayers themselves.
What from Maya Y? What is some of the origin of Seder Karbanos?
Of Karbanos?
Yeah.
The Rosh Hashanah, sure. So the institution of tefillah, the Gemara says, Meseches Brachos, Daf Chav Ches, was karbanos. Just like there was a carbon tamid shel shachar, there was a carbon tamid shel ben arbaim, that's shachar and mincha. Ma'ariv, the Gemara says, is keneged evar mupedarim, the fats and the sinews that were burnt in the evening. So therefore, the basis of prayer, of tefillah, of what we call shachar, mincha, ma'ariv, is karbanos. We don't have karbanos today. We're waiting, pining, praying, hoping, davening, anticipating the rebuilding of the Beis HaMikdash. So therefore, what we're doing is keeping us busy until we are able to return to the Beis HaMikdash and have karbanos. There's certainly a lot of indication that along with karbanos, there were prayers that were recited. Certainly, there were certain Mizmorei Tehillim that were recited. It seems that the Shemona Esrei existed, in between the first and second Beis HaMikdash. Shema existed, Berchos Kriya Shema existed. But the focus of the recitation of karbanos, the way the Shulchan Aruch and halachic authorities indicate, is that it's supposed to mimic the offering of a karban and the repentance and the atonement that came with a karban. Chazal indicate that when you recite the verses that refer to those particular karbanos, the way that Chazal says in the Shalma Parim Sefarsenu, if we recite the words, the text of the karbanos, whether it's the karban olah, the karban chatas, that are supposed to be recited, whether it's the Ketores, etc., it's as if we are offering a korban in the Beis HaMikdash when unfortunately we don't have the Beis HaMikdash. So the institution of karbanos at the beginning of the prayer service, and by the way, there are many who recite karbanos, the karban tam shel bein arbaim before mincha, as a way to be able to connect to the karban, to the sacrifice that was offered at that time. Now, these are not mandatory recitations. Shulchan Aruch says certain karbanos should be recited. The karban tamid should be recited daily. That's what Shulchan Aruch says. But nonetheless, it's not what we call tefillah. So if an individual understands and is able, it's the right thing to do. It's a good thing to do. And the Shulchan Aruch in the beginning of Orach Chaim, Siman Aleph through Siman Daled, dictates which of the verses in Sefer Vayikra are more important to be recited. If you take a look at the beginning of your siddur, before Mizmor Shir Chanukah Sabayis David, you'll begin to see the siddur and which tefillos and which karbanos are there. And there were certain additions that were made in order to appreciate those karbanos.
I think we're going to hand the floor back to Shulamis.
Yeah, thank you both so very much, Rabbi Walter, Uriel. Also, I want to give a shout out to JB, behind the scenes tech person. He's without him, this never would have happened. And also, I want to put in the chat Rabbi Walter's email because there are questions that were not addressed because we ran out of time. And that's because there was such a rich discussion. I thought I knew a lot about the siddur, but I learned so much more, and my appetite is whetted to keep going. So as we said before, the book is available for purchase. Thank God I was able to get a discount through Zberman and Passaic. And there are a limited number of copies. So there's a link that went out on the chat. It will also be sent by email to all who registered. So you can order your book, and as long as you pick it up from the YU library. If you live in Teaneck, then I can bring it home for you. But I can't say that for my mother is in Deerfield Beach. I will bring her a copy, Mir Hashem, when I visit her on Shavuos. Anybody else, you could talk to me privately. She's waving. We could figure something out. We're all Jews, and we have all these listservs and ways of getting things to people, so we can do it that way. But that again, that link for ordering was put in the chat. Do you want to put it again, Uriel, please? So this way, because it might have gotten lost in the shuffle. But I just, again, thank you everybody for coming. This is a record turnout, and it just shows you that this topic is really meaningful to people. Really, it's just something that, if you daven every day, even if you don't daven every day, but you talk to God, this is very important to understand the background, and there's so much more to be said. So maybe there will be a part
If
two.
somebody has another question or two, I'm happy to take it. I don't know what your schedule is, but if
You
there's
know
another,
what? How about whoever wants to leave, leave. You're dismissed, and whoever wants to stay on, just stay on and
I have
answer
I, I
questions.
ha- I have a few more minutes if there are any other questions.
I think we had some more from
Yeah,
before.
there are a couple
Yeah.
more questions in the chat. We can keep going through those. Here. Um, okay, let's ask questions from people who are still here. Chaim Laufer asks, how about the physical elements, lifting our feet for Kadosh Kadosh, taking steps back before and after Shemona Esrei, dancing toward the moon by Kirush Levana?
Where did the physical
Yeah,
elements
where
of
yeah,
tefillin?
where'd those come from?
That much of that is actually from Chazal. The Gemara talks about what one should do, how to pray, how you should be positioned when you pray, when to stand, when to sit, what to sit for, what to stand for. The Vilna Gaon actually has a whole different approach to this question in terms of when to stand and how to stand. The Gemara tells us that Shemona Esrei is actually referred to as Amida, that one must stand for. Shema is debated in the Mishnayos. It's actually a debate between Beis Hillel and Beis Shammai. Should you stand or should you sit based upon the words in Shema b'shach b'cha v'kumecha? So the broader answer to your question is similar to the way many halachic questions are addressed. There are verses in the Torah. The Mishnayos discuss some of it, and the Gemara extrapolates, discusses, and debates exactly what should be done and how it should be done. None of the things that were mentioned are what's called ma'akev, are absolutely required, minus sitting for Shema. That we passing like the opinion of Beis Hillel that you must sit for Shema in the morning and evening. You must stand for Shemona Esrei. Therefore, if somebody's ill or not feeling well or is traveling, we have to know exactly how one is able to recite the Shemona Esrei if you can't stand. And those are all discussed in halachic authorities and then developed from the Shulchan Aruch and many of the great codifiers of Jewish law and the primary commentaries on the Shulchan Aruch.
Chayesar Cantor asks, I find HaRabbanim easy to understand, but not the medieval liturgy. The Hebrew seems to have changed.
Again, I missed that.
Chayesar Cantor asks, I find HaRabbanim easy to understand, but not the medieval liturgy. Did the Hebrew change?
Okay, good. So you're gonna have to wait for my next book, The Making of a Machzor, because stay tuned, right? Piyutim is a whole nother topic. And if you don't understand it, you're in good company because the Ebenezer himself said he didn't understand Piyutim, and therefore he writes that we shouldn't recite Piyutim altogether. Piyutim is the liturgy that was authored by some of the great early Gaonim and Rishonim. Much of what takes place in the Machzor, Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur, a lot of that has actually been omitted from the Siddur for the reason that you have asked, that people don't understand it. And Piyut is difficult. Piyut is poetry. Piyut has references to Tanakh. Piyut is written in Aramaic, in Hebrew. It's halachic work. And therefore the challenge in understanding it is not you alone, it's all of us, including some of the great medieval scholars. And that surrounds around the debate as to whether or not Piyutim should be recited or not. So you don't feel bad. You're in good company, and that's the reason why many do not recite Piyutim on a regular basis.
Yeah, I think that's pretty much it from the chat.
Tanya, so there's another one from Bonita. Do you see that?
Yeah, can you say a few words about Kanshus Romani? Are you referring to Nusach Rome? If you're referring to Nusach Rome is an ancient Nusach and arguably one of the oldest and most important Nuschos that exist. There's actually something called the Machzor Rome. The Machzor of Rome was similar to what I referred to earlier as the Machzor Vitri. The Machzor of Rome was the Machzor which was written, you're referring to the Greek. I'm not sure. I'm not sure you're referring to in terms of the Greek. I'm not familiar with that. I'm not familiar with the Greek Nusach. The Rome Nusach is a very important Nusach. Romaniot, I'm not sure. I'm not familiar with that. I don't have anything to add to that. I'm sorry.
Um, okay, so you know what? This leaves it open for future discussion. And like I said, I'm going to be emailing you the recording for those of you who missed part of this, or even if you didn't miss it, you want to review it. You definitely need a chazara for all this information. We're not going to give you any tests though. So thank you again, Rabbi Walter, for taking the time to present your book and your knowledge. And thank you, Uriel, and thank you, JB, and everybody have a great night. Have a good Shabbos.
Thank you. Thank you for the invitation
Thank
and
you.
wishing everybody a good Shabbos and lots of good luck.